Welcome everybody. I'm Diana Marsh. I'm an assistant professor in archives and digital curation here in the College of Information. And this is our April Center for Archival Futures, or CAFE talk, with Jess Grimmer. We are the co-directors of CAFE. And CAFE brings together interdisciplinary researchers on not just archives, but digital curation and preservation, community work, and a whole range of issues broadly construed. We've been around since 2021. So do check out our website. We've got a lot of pretty cool past events. You can check out things there and on YouTube if you'd like to go down memory lane on some of the past talks we've done. And we also run other research projects collectively and as individuals. So go check out all of that. And as part of this is our flagship talk series. So we really try to bring together exciting and innovative discussions on these topics. And today is a really, really exciting collaborative interdisciplinary event. So we've been really looking forward to this. And I'll pass it to Jess.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Today we are beaming in from College Park, Maryland, which is located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. As members of the University of Maryland, we acknowledge as a land-grant university the 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land taken and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act of 1862. We want to acknowledge the separation that these acts of colonialism generated between Indigenous peoples and their homelands. We honor the continued power and resilience of Indigenous communities and nations and celebrate the collaborative and decolonializing work now taking place in our collections and our institutions. We further acknowledge the University of Maryland's connections to slavery and to generations of racialized trauma rooted in the institution. As a member college of the universities studying slavery, the University of Maryland has undertaken the 1856 Project, committed to investigating and illuminating these histories. The 1856 Project endeavors to lay a path toward restorative history, allowing for the institution to engage in the work of moral accountability and reconciliation. Through this work, the University of Maryland recommits itself to creating equitable, inclusive, and diverse curricula and spaces. And thank you so much, Diana, for putting many of the resources around maps and the 1856 project in the chat so that everyone can take a look at the really great work going on in those projects. And now I would love to introduce our esteemed panel today. So I'll go ahead and start each one of you just real quickly. DeNeen Brown has been an award-winning writer for the Washington Post for more than 37 years. Brown is a professor at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism, where she teaches feature writing, covering social justice issues for newspapers and magazines, and the power of the writing voice. Brown has written extensively about the country's history of racial terror lynchings and massacres, climate change, and indigenous populations. Rob Wells is an associate professor at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland, where he teaches data reporting and is the PhD studies director. He is a journalism historian specializing in business journalism and also conducts research on data journalism. Among his accomplishments is leading students at the University of Arkansas to produce the award-winning arkansascovid.com website, where published daily updates of data and news on where they published updates of data and news on the daily comings of the COVID-19 pandemic. Jeff Suess is a history columnist and librarian at the Cincinnati Enquirer. He is the author of several books on Cincinnati history, some of my favorite, including Lost Cincinnati, Hidden History of Cincinnati, Cincinnati Then and Now, and Cincinnati: An Illustrated Timeline. He wrote Tomorrowland, The Past, Present, and the Future of Disney's Most Challenged Land, and edited the Cincinnati Reds books Pete Rose, A Tribute to a Baseball Legend, and Big Red Machine, Cincinnati's Dynasty 50 Years Late. And Katherine Boss is head librarian and web archiving curator at the National Library of Norway. She previously worked as the librarian for journalism, media, and culture and communication at New York University. Her research focuses on the challenges of archiving born digital news content and pedagogies in a library and in library instruction. She has served as the co-chair of the Association of College and Research Libraries Communication Studies Committee, as well as the co-leader of the Archiving and Preserving News Applications Working Group of the Journalism Digital News Archive. So, first of all, everyone, please join me in thanking this panel for joining us here today. I couldn't be more thrilled to see all of you here, and what a fascinating panel where we're going to get to see a lot of different sides of this issue. This roundtable was really convened to examine the relationship among newspaper archives, data practices, and evolving news infrastructures. And with that, we're going to dive right in. So Diana and I will be posing some questions here, and we'd love to hear, what our panelists have to say about these topics. So I'll just go ahead and start with a sort of broad question. We're thinking about in this day and age, what counts as an archive of journalism data today? As journalism expands beyond print into databases, interactive features, and web applications, what does an archive look like? And who is responsible for defining it and preserving it? And, we'd love to hear from all of you on this question especially, but why don't you, for the sake of someone starting, DeNeen, would you like to start in here?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. When I started at the Washington Post, I started in the golden age of journalism. I started at the Post right out of college, so I was there when these journalism legends still roamed the newsroom. I was hired by the famous Watergate editor, Ben Bradley. Bob Woodward was still in the newsroom. So I was this young person sitting there watching, just amazed at the talent in the newsroom. So I was there. I witnessed presses. Presses were still operating. We still had telephones with rotary cords. We had clips of our stories were kept in these vanilla folders in the morgue. We called the library and the old newsroom of the Washington Post the morgue. And you had to descend staircases to get there. And there were librarians, actual humans who you could say, I'm working on a story about a bridge in Maryland, and they would know exactly where to find this information and pull out actual clips and these vanilla envelopes so that we could do our research. I often tell my students, I was lucky enough to be there during this golden age. Catherine Graham was still upstairs. And then starting that young, being there during the digital age. So for me, an archive of journalism still looks like the morgue. I actually still teach my students to read physical newspapers and clip them out. And I think with my students, what I'm hearing is there's a backlash against AI coming from these young people, a backlash against digital information. We talk about how when you go to these traditional clips, actual physical clips, you can read them, go to lunch, come back, and they're still on the dining room table. Um, so I think that's what archives look like to me. I think we also we'll talk about this later, but I think we're in an age where it's a pretty dangerous chapter in our country's history where archives online are being erased or being vanished, web pages are being disappeared. I know that last year I spent weeks basically cutting and pasting my stories that had run in the post so that I could save them. So the short answer to your question is there's archives look different for many different people, but I do believe personally the best archives are those that we can lock up in a box these days.
I was going to build on what DeNeen said, and I remember the librarians at the Associated Press. They were so great. I scandalized the library staff by having librarian Randy Hershoff as a second byline on an investigation in the banking industry because he had done so much work. And I said, we never do that. I go, well, he deserves it. He did some incredible research to make this story come together. And those librarians are far and few between now. But I was kind of thinking about this question about archives of journalism today and in the social media context and sort of the broader corporate context of information control. So when we have these corporate owners who may not have a socially defined mission, like Twitter, Facebook, Meta, we have a lot of problems. As a researcher, I'm sure many people on this call might have used Twitter and the API access to get to the back end of Twitter and to do significant time series research over time. And that went away when Musk took over Twitter, and then Facebook changed its whole approach to archiving news content. I mean, you can go through and cut and paste things, but to really look at it as a historian over time, you need to have the application programming interface, to download it at scale. And that went away and is now in this heavily, heavily curated process that's run by the University of Michigan. It took me, as a tenured faculty member, 5 months to get access to. And my students are, kind of left in the ditch. This was the whole purpose of it. So, we are kind of left. Some of my students are left to using some fairly primitive means of copying and pasting just to do basic content analysis on social media platforms. And then things get worse when we look at the major proprietary database owners, ProQuest being one. Having worked with ProQuest on a pilot project, very, very difficult group. And they are limiting our access to news content, So it for some significant portion of content that's distributed, news content by social media, and then in these databases, there are a lot of challenges, and I just find it to be kind of a whack-a-mole project where you design one strategy to get access and it changes 6 months later. So it's very dynamic and very, very problematic for us to be able to do this sort of historical research over time with the current situation.
I could jump in. Um, it's such an interesting question. And also, I think it's so funny that the Post called it the morgue because I've heard that the New York Times also called it the morgue. And to librarians, that's just kind of horrifying, but also funny. And it makes sense. We get it. Um, yeah, I think one big issue, like one heartbreaking trend that Rob also mentioned, is the shuttering of newsroom libraries, of internal libraries in newsrooms. And Kathleen Hansen and Nora Paul wrote an amazing book called Future Proofing the News that talks about this, and it kind of details. They used to work at a newsroom in Florida. I could have been the Miami Herald, I'm not sure. But after their newsroom library shuttered, they started doing this research. Yeah, so that was an unfortunate trend. Newsrooms were just cutting. They were cutting everywhere, and the libraries were the first to go. So, um, so newsrooms are not. There are a few newsrooms who have reopened their newsroom libraries. I believe NPR has a really good one, but it's not the norm anymore. So if the newsroom isn't taking care of their own legacy, it falls to libraries to do it. I do think that's kind of okay because we've always done that. Like libraries, that is our mandate, that is our mission, is to try and get the historical record and the news in all of its published forms. We have the people, we have the expertise, we that's us. That's our work. And the libraries jigsaw it out. So when I first started working in libraries when I was 19, I worked at the Grand Rapids Public Library in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where my mom also worked. I'm a third generation librarian. My grandma was also a librarian. And anyway, the Grand Rapids Public Library had the entire record of the Grand Rapids Press. And also a lot of other local papers, the Holland Sentinel and the Traverse City Record Eagle. New York City is not going to have these papers, but we had them. And so libraries locally would collect locally and try and get the most thorough record of all of the news in that area. That is not happening today with all of the different challenges of trying to archive news in all of the formats that it is being published. And it is so many feeds and it's so many channels. And so, as Rob mentioned, it's like news is being published on Facebook, on X feeds, on TikTok. There are many, many ways that the news is being published. There are many channels. And many of them are on these proprietary platforms that are very hostile to archiving. At the Norwegian National Library, we are just starting a pilot to try and archive Instagram and Facebook, the Norwegian content, because we're the Norwegian National Library. So once again, like jigsawing, no one else in the world is collecting this Norwegian news content, but we are, so it works out well. But Facebook is constantly changing its code base and threatening libraries that it's against their terms of service to archive, even politicians' feeds, which should be, community feeds, which are essentially, this is a public discourse that is happening on a private platform, and it's a bit infuriating. We don't pay any attention to them because at least in Norway, we have laws that say anything published in Norway, it's pliktallevering, it's a mandatory legal deposit. I wish the US had this. It would make archiving so much easier. The Library of Congress right now is like doing the Lord's work, trying to archive all of this content. And they really struggle because of they don't have this law behind them that says you have to deliver all this stuff. Yeah, but unfortunately, so with technical challenges, it's very hard to capture and archive a lot of content, including dynamic data journalism. It is heartbreaking to me to think of COVID dashboards that we were not able to capture. Those are for many technical reasons. They're just so dynamic. Traditional web archiving tools often can't get them, and that's the same with social media. So the journalism record right now is very full of holes, I would say. Archivally speaking, like what libraries have been able to get is just nothing close to the amount of journalism that has been published in the past, 30 years. Digital journalism. We've got a good handle on like what went to the print feeds, like what was being sent to printing presses. Probably we've got most of that. But the digital stuff, it's very full of holes, unfortunately.
So I have a complicated view of the archives. So very quickly, my background, I started working in the Library of the Enquirer in 1999 when we had a staff of 7 people who worked from 9 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week. We were archiving the paper and we were there for research, for breaking news, deadlines, the copy desk asking a question at 11:30 to verify things. And what you guys are talking about, I was young, but I had these great librarians that I learned from, who are exactly those people you guys mentioned. And I was the early digital age, and then we started moving into the internet, and everything kind of completely changed at that point. In 2009, I became the last one standing. And as of 2009 to now, I've been the entire library staff. And for job protection and stuff, I started branching out to writing. And 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, we moved buildings. And when we moved the buildings, we went from 4 floors to half a floor, and there was no room for the library. And so I had a 6 month long task of dismantling the library and figuring out what we can keep, where I can move things off to. And going back to like our newspapers, they also have I've kind of realized over the years that what we think of as like a newspaper library is like a library. We're archiving and saving these things for the future. But that's not, I don't think that was their philosophy. I think their philosophy was, we are saving these facts or these photos to use again, to be a reference for when I'm going to use it. And so if someone dies, we don't need that photo anymore. And so it went away. So our photo archive went back to roughly World War II, end of World War II, and very few things before that. Major events like the 1937 flood we had, but we didn't have, say, Charles Lindbergh showing up in town in 1928, or 27. Stuff like that. You'd think, oh, wow, you had tons of photos. Why didn't we save that? That was just not seem to be the philosophy. Over the years, it evolved so that they were saving everything. And so from my sense that, I still prefer the paper, as you said, yeah. But out of necessity and space, I literally had no space. And went from having, a quarter of a floor to no space at all. So we, like, for instance, for our photos, we donated them to the public library in Cincinnati, and they are digitizing them all and making them available to the public. And so that was a really important move for us, that I wanted to make sure that stuff did not get lost, and that if I were to lose my job or move on, there would be nobody to replace it, because there are not that many librarians left in news organizations. So I'm still there. I don't really have much of a physical library anymore. Everything's digital that we have, but I'm still kind of the steward of it. But that's really just a part of my job now, that I'm spending most of my time as a history writer. But I've seen the changes and the challenges. You talked about saving the physical, or the news that goes into the paper, that goes to the printing press, and how that's by and large pretty well saved. And I'm actually pleased that I know there's some issues with a lot of these digital archives, but we are getting more and more available. The fact that full papers and obscure papers have been completely digitized and are available through sources. I mean, I was doing a research project about something in South Dakota, and I was able to read the newspapers in small towns in Iowa and South Dakota to do research, because those collections that one regional library saved have that can be digitized, and I can do all that from home, which is great. That at least it's accessible. So it's kind of a positive of that. And then, as Katherine said, with the digital thing, that's everything now in a newsroom, that the newspaper is a afterthought. Everything's print online, and that's really what a newspaper is these days, is a website. And that is so much harder to archive. And so what we've ended up kind of doing de facto is we use our own system. When we write a story, we put it in the system, and we can go back and search those systems. And so we end up, even though we have a digital archive of all of the text and all of the photos, that's really not what people are using that much in a newsroom. They're defaulting to just doing a Google search and finding their stories from 6 months ago or 2 years ago. And that has lots of other problems, because not only you talked about the archives and some places that the proprietary owners can affect accessibility, But there's also the issue of just the internal, when we first started doing internet pages in the 90s and early 2000s, those links disappeared. Those pages didn't stay because they weren't that considered to be that important. For a while, they had a process where after 60 days, the link would be severed and it's somewhere out in the ether of the internet, but there's no link to it. And that's changed because that's our priority now, is to do a digital product, but there is really nothing in place for a archive. So it's continuing to evolve, and I guess that's what we're going to talk
about. So I'm so appreciative that you ended on this issue right now of kind of use. And so our next question for everybody was, in this very complicated landscape for doing especially more recent historical research, but also where still kind of more traditional kind of historical research might be important to certain kinds of work. How do you all see journalists using archives and historical sources today? What are the kinds of ways you see them accessing those things, mobilizing those things? And I know, Rob, before we got on, we were talking about perhaps students right this very minute in the archives. And then Katherine, we thought we might tap you as well, doing a lot of that kind of interfacing with users.
So I'm lucky here at the Merrill College to teach classes that can be topical when we come up with we identify a significant issue. Class I'm teaching right now is doing a historical investigation of a boys' reform school in Maryland where some 230 boys died from 1870 to 1940. And they were all, it was a segregated school. All these kids were Black. The companion school, the deaths were just a fraction of that. And that was up in Baltimore County. And so we have been doing a couple things to get news out of archives. The first one was we got access to death certificates for about 140 of these young men, and ran that through an AI handwriting translator to determine the cause of death and the common cause of death and the ages. And that turned out to be using, findofgrave.com as a news source. And it was a story that was led by master student here at Merrill College, Nicole Ramos. Got statewide coverage and added a lot to not only the news coverage of this ongoing investigation about what happened at this reform school, but added a lot to the historic record. And so based on the work of this class last semester, there's now I have a class that's going even deeper into the archives, so we are scanning annual reports from the 1860s and 1870s, grand jury transcripts, depositions, court filings, all sorts of material to really come up with an answer before the state investigation gives us the answer in a couple of years. What happened to these boys? How could this possibly happen? And to highlight the racial disparities, there was a system of contract labor that was as brutal as you might see in Georgia back in the post-Reconstruction era. It's significant. So this is a very kind of ambitious project that the school has been wonderful in supporting, of using combination of digital research and traditional archival research. And so I had two students up in the city archives of Baltimore today pulling out grand jury reports and looking for litigation to nail down a forced labor story. So you can do a lot if you have the time and the resources to go into these archives, and these students fortunately have the ability to do that. So it's a really, really fulfilling project.
Maybe we'll hand it to Katherine next, since you're mentioning sort of being on that front end of users.
Oh, yes. You mean for students doing stories
Or
using
if
the
you
archive?
see, if you ever see journalists, do you find that journalists are coming to the library to do research there? Or
Yes. Yeah.
are you mostly thinking about, like sort of archiving the existing journalism out in the world?
Yes. So actually, I don't work so much directly with users in my current role at the National Library, but I did a lot at NYU, working with the students and the faculty on the projects that are very similar to what Rob is talking about. NYU is also doing a lot of really excellent work. But I can talk about how people are using web archives, which I think is kind of interesting. It's kind of a new area of research because web archives have existed for about 25, 30 years, the Internet Archive being the most famous at web.archive.org and the first. I believe the Internet Archive has has the first instance of NewYorkTimes.com, and kind of similar to what Jeff said, the New York Times does not have their own record of their own website. The Internet Archive has it before they have it. You know, they were thinking to save it before the New York Times was thinking to save its own website, I believe. I think that goes back to like 94 or not or something. But so I would say there's probably a good 25 solid years of internet archiving for news publications. Certainly in the US, the coverage is very, very strong. In Norway, they've also been collecting a lot. Norway was a very early adapter to internet archiving and was part of a group that developed the first web archiving tool with the Internet Archive. So Norway has really also been on the forefront. But yeah, it's still a fairly new archival medium. So research in Internet Archives is just kind of picking up. And Mark Graham at the Internet Archive posts every couple of months about all the interesting stories that are being reported, that journalists are using those Internet Archives to report on stories. And there's countless examples, especially during the Trump administration, where, I don't know, the world is getting gaslit constantly about what they've said or what they've done. The Internet Archive and other web archives are capturing um, not just news websites, but all kinds of websites every hour, every day. You know, there's different frequencies for all of these different web captures. And there have been some really famous examples of how those have been used lately. When I was the journalism librarian at NYU, I would always show the students the Internet Archive and other web archives because it is a great way to stabilize volatile information. You know, volatile information is like how tweets can be edited, tweets can be taken down. This content changes rapidly, so journalists need to be able to create a more stable version of that media. And so I would always show the Save Page Now tool, for example, on the Internet Archive's homepage. When a journalist finds something that they say to themselves, oh no, as soon as I report this story, they're going to want to change this or delete it or take it down. And so you archive it right then. And to use the Save Page Now tool and to create that web archive, it's transparent. The whole world can see the timestamp on that archived website. So it's better than a screenshot. A screenshot is better than nothing. Like your own personal screenshot of a website or whatever you might be using to back up a story. But certainly to have that transparent, publicly available copy archived is the best. Yeah, 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 yeah. See the Save Page Now. It's a beautiful tool. I believe it was developed by Ben Welsh at the LA Times when he was at the LA Times in coordination with the Internet Archive. Yes, so it was, I believe. I'm not sure about that, but I know Ben, and he's done a lot of great work in the archiving community.
Very,
Um,
very cool.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, a lot of super cool work being done with web archives.
Amazing. And Jeff and DeNeen, other, feel free, either of you, if you've got other thoughts on this topic.
Well, I can answer the question of how journalists are using archives. Um, as a reporter, I was a founding member of the team at the Washington Post called Retropolis, and our assignment was to write about history literally on deadline. So we would go from zero knowledge to 90 miles per hour, I would say, on deadline. So, for example, if President Trump is talking about the 13th Amendment with Kanye West, I remember my editor coming by and saying, write a story about what the 13th Amendment was. And this is what it looked like, basically utilizing archives on deadline and then writing a version of history for the current. I developed this methodology of looking for primary resources to help bring the story to life. Um, I often use the Library of Congress, National Archives. I used National Park Service. I used sometimes I would go to physical libraries if I had time, running to the library to check out a book, because I was always trying to collect as much primary information, primary documents as I could for my stories that would be published in a matter of minutes, hours, or days. My philosophy was I wanted, under my byline, DeNeen L. Brown, I wanted original reporting. If, for example, I'm writing about Juneteenth, I remember one night going to the Library of Congress archives and looking at the testimony transcripts of the enslaved Africans because I wanted to hear the voice of someone who had been in slavery. And I spent several minutes, maybe an hour, transcribing that recording at the Library of Congress to bring my story to life. So when I'm talking about writing this history for the present, I'm also very passionate about diving into history and touching, again, primary sources of history. I wanted, original newspaper pieces as much as possible. As you know, journalism, they say, is the first draft of history. So sometimes I'm diving into archives to look at newspapers from the 1700s or the 1800s. Did a lot of research on newspapers.com. So I teach my students to try to use all these resources as much as possible. And again, as Katherine was saying, there's this danger of those resources being lost online. And I began noticing this more than 5 years ago when I was writing a story about the Willie Horton campaign, um, and looking for the original ad that Bush had run. And I just could not find it. I could not find that clip of the video online, but it had been disappeared. And I started noticing other sources about Black history or about topics that were controversial missing from these online resources, which was disturbing, like really, really disturbing. And now it's come full throttle. So again, we live in such a precarious time, and I thank librarians and archivists for trying to save this history. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to preserve as much as we can these stories, these histories, these primary documents um, for as long as we can.
Couple things I'd add, like what Dee was talking about, doing the research of stories. So my basic beat is I have a history column every week, and so I have basically 4 days to research and write a story about a number of topics. Um, and I do, like you said, you go back and try to find the voices that you can pull out of the news and what they said at the time. Sometimes you're really surprised. Like one time, I decided to see what people said about the Gettysburg Address, and so I went back to look at the news coverage. And the Inquirer was a really conservative paper back then, and they basically um, and was not a fan of Lincoln, and they basically said, "This is the dumbest speech you've ever heard." This is what he said, and they just kind of repeated the. But in doing that, also we found that the Cincinnati Commercial at the time, which was a one of I think only 5 papers that actually had a reporter at Gettysburg writing about it, and you read the account of what they had, and there's actually some slight different phrases in what they wrote than the version of the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln later recorded, and that's the version that we use. So sometimes like I said, you can go back to those first sources and find other bits of information that you wouldn't normally have. But then I think that a lot of, so like I said, that's my job. I'm on newspapers.com 90% of my day. uh, and but I think a lot of other reporters, they don't always necessarily think about delving into history, and they need to be kind of reminded of these resources. But a lot of other stuff is um, more like stuff like what Rob was talking about, a big project where they're delving into specific records, and I have colleagues that have done stuff on like incarceration, or um, we had some former colleagues that did podcasts on people who were um, in jail, wrongly accused, and their big long project to track everything down. So those people are digging into big resources that or data. There's a lot of data mining that reporters are doing. So it's not necessarily looking at newspaper archives, but I think we talked about in some of these questions that there's stuff beyond news stories that are now part of the resources that we need to preserve. And uh, the philosophy I was kind of had about when we're saving this stuff is that it may look like, we're cutting back at the libraries, but it may look like we're just saving a story, and what does it really matter? But it's like, we're not saving it for now, because right now I can find this story. But by saving it in other forms, you can find it 50 years from now or 100 years from now. And that's the role that we have in the libraries and archives that we need to keep. And the danger of like losing funding and stuff like that is actually losing that stuff much. Once it's gone, there's no one there to go back to find this stuff.
Katie, I see you have a hand up if you wanted to chime in before I ask our last question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what DeNeen and Jeff are saying. It's so interesting because yes, that's like what builds these stories and what these historical stories are always based on is the primary sources, which are so difficult to find. And like, what is the primary source that is reflective of the culture of today? 25 years from now, what are the primary sources that people are going to want to examine? How is everybody consuming their news? They're consuming it on social media. It's an Instagram post by the New York Times or by NPR, or it's a Facebook post, and there's all kinds of comments. It's like, how did people react? How did people react to Trump saying he's going to obliterate an entire civilization? You know, like how. And that's very difficult to get. We're trying to get it, but like the technical difficulties for librarians of trying to get this content in its original context and then also to get the discussion around it is just so hard. And the companies that are hosting the platforms that are hosting this cultural conversation are just so hostile to archiving. It's appalling, but we do our best. We're doing our best. We're really giving it our best shot.
Boy, I share your frustration, and thank you for articulating it so well.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, everyone. Let me see. I have one last question, and I think we've started to get there already. So I'll bring this really to the surface then. So, given our data and archiving practices, where do we see the most urgent risks right now if we're looking forward? what are the most pressing threats to the continuity and access of news archives, whether those are technological, economic, or institutional, and where do we see intervention needed the most? And I guess hand in hand with that, how can journalists navigate or attempt to reconstruct missing, incomplete, or inaccessible archives? And how might that affect the investigative and historical work in those silences? And I absolutely want to hear from all of you here. Let me see. Let's start because you're working in this sort of like in between position. Jeff, why don't you lead us off here?
Well, I think a lot of the danger is the shifting of platforms too. That you when I started, it was still digital, but there was a few years of the archive they were only on CD-ROM, and the dangers of having a digital only archive. Not only can it be manipulated or but catastrophic failure. About 15 years ago, we had our main hard drive had a catastrophic failure and the backup hard drive. We lost both of them. So we lost the entire archive. But because we had resold them to other places like ProQuest, we could buy them back. And so we had to buy back our own content in order to repopulate our. But heck, an EMP device could knock out Library of Congress, and what would that do? We're relying more on PDFs and digital things. Library of Congress doesn't take newspapers anymore for microfilm. It's all PDFs. And so they're trying to keep the physical media, having a lack of resources and room. Like when we closed the library and we had no room, I saved what I could in my basement, which my wife is thrilled with. The Cincinnati history books that I kept. But you couldn't save everything. It's the news organizations are in survival mode. They're not worried about the archives. They've long moved beyond that. So I'm one of the last people who are still technically employed as a librarian. But even that, it doesn't say that on my job description. It says I'm a history writer, and the library stuff is sort of hidden. And so I think those are dangers of doing that. And we've talked about how do you capture these things. If you even think about like your own photos, and you have all these photo albums that you have at home when you're a kid or you're a teenager, and you snapshots and stuff. And now we have 30,000 photos from our phones that's now taking up a bunch of data, and then your computer crashes. And oops, well, I don't have that backed up. And everything that we've thrown everything out there, but we haven't been able to really archive them the same way that we save things. And even more so, back in the old days, you wrote in the back, this is Aunt Helen, 1952. Now it's a digital file. When we're gone, nope, there's metadata, but nobody knows who these people are in these pictures or whatever. And so all those kind of, every time we get a new platform for, information, we have to somehow migrate everything else into that new platform. And that's going to be a continual challenge, I think, every time we come up with something new.
Can I give you, I think I wanted to share an anecdote of how important these archives are and the power that lies in libraries and archives. When I was researching and writing stories for the Washington Post about the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, which had been erased from history, I went to the University of Tulsa's library and I talked to a librarian there, and he told me that when he was hired to move from Colorado to Tulsa to work at the University of Tulsa's library, he noticed that many articles and magazines and other periodicals were missing. He said that someone had literally gone through the archives of the library with a razor, like a physical razor, and cut out any article that had a mention of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre in it. because the city of Tulsa and officials then, civic officials and elected officials, were very embarrassed by the massacre that occurred in 1921, which left as many as 300 Black people dead and thousands of homes buried. They wanted to erase that incident from history. And they were pretty successful for dozens of years, almost 100 years. But it was this librarian and the University of Tulsa's library who went and tried to find, pulled other resources to complete um, the archive of these articles. He found what was missing and then went to other sources to replace it. So I wanted to share that because it's a it shows how dangerous it is to be living at a time when people want history erased. What gets lost is institutional memory. Missing information means journalism sometimes is incomplete. Stories are incomplete. History gets distorted. So journalism is really in the fight for its life. And I think it's going to take us all as individuals, as reporters, as librarians, as professors, students, to try to preserve history.
So DeNeen's story here is just really, really compelling. These erasures are happening all over the place. There was an example in Harrison, Arkansas. There were race riots, and I don't think they actually call them riots. There was an attempt to erase the entire Black population of this small town in the Ozarks in 1905 and 1909, and it was basically brutal, white violence against the small Black population. One of my colleagues, when I taught at the University of Arkansas, went and tried to do some research in the local Harrison newspaper. And during the worst of the violence, the paper's editions were gone. She was able to recreate what happened and also document an erasure of history. So it's just absolutely horrifying. I think in terms of what we should be doing going forward, I would love to see the Knight Foundation or some large journalism foundation set aside an emergency fund to help archive some of these emerging digital first platforms. I'm speaking from experience. I was very proud of Arkansas COVID. We were able to, as a student-run news organization that provided daily coverage of what was happening during the pandemic in depth that was not happening in the local news media. And the students did fantastic work. I was offered a job at University of Maryland to come back here, tried to find a home for Arkansas COVID, and there wasn't anybody who could run the website. Tried to find somebody who could take over and archive it. Nobody could do it. Tried to make that somebody's job. Nobody had enough time. We had money to archive it. It's gone. It's horrible. And, I just don't want to see that happen again. For that to happen under my watch was really tragic. But that's just speaking from personal experience. We need to have a fund and a protocol to help these small news websites develop a permanent, archival structure.
And I could jump in. I think another thing from the library's perspective that is really needed is more web archivists. We don't have enough. It's a very under-resourced part of libraries, I would say, from what I've seen from all the institutions I've worked at. NYU had one web archivist, and we had a lot of other human resources in other areas, but the web is it's huge, and web archiving, a lot of it happens automatically. A lot of it can be automated, but then there's a very long tail of the internet that requires um, more human resources to capture and collect. And it's really, really important stuff. All of this social media, all of these interactive maps, all of these dynamic data journalism news projects that are born digital, they're digital first. All of this stuff that's being published, like we need folks. We need more people in web archiving who are trained to do this. So if there are any students out there who are interested, contact me and I can talk to you about it. I love it. It's really fun. It's very cool work. And it's really a kind of the way forward, I think, for our field, for a big part of our field. Um, Yes, and I can give an example. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Like a great example of content that's very difficult to digitally archive is any of these interactive maps. Traditional web archiving tools, when they try and grab a map, it just really blows up a crawl. Like if you're trying to capture all of the potential API crawls, the API calls that map will make, it's almost infinite. And so you can get into like a 3, 4, 5 gigabyte crawl very quickly, which is very expensive. It's way too large. This is all a little bit in the technical details, but it is to say there is a different tool that librarians have to use more manually, where we would say, I'm building a collection of COVID data journalism dashboards. And so then the librarian has to go in and use a tool called archiveweb.page and then just click around in a map, for example, to build a collection. It's not everything, but then at least we have a representative sample of, for example, some of this content that can't be captured. And that goes for all kinds of data journalism projects. Basically, everything that ProPublica has reported also has to be archived in a very kind of, we call it high fidelity web archiving. And that takes people to do. And then just trying to play cat and mouse with all these different platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. They're constantly trying to prevent us from archiving, and then we have to find new ways to archive it. So it's very fun work. Highly recommend.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I love ending on the call to action. So everyone in the audience, if you're thinking about web archiving, here it is.
I see a bunch of my intro to archives and digital creation students are here in the room. So you heard it
Yes.
here, folks. You heard it here.
We see you here. We know you're ready. Everyone, thank you so, so much for this. Such an engaging talk. I was, could listen to this conversation go on for a few more hours. Um, and we're nearly at the end of the hour, but we're gonna, if you're willing to stay with us, friends, um, I, we'd love to take some questions. We do hold the tradition here of giving the first question at least, if not more than just the first question to one of our students. So friends, you can feel free to unmute and ask a question or throw a hand up so we don't talk over each other. Or if you'd like to put it in the chat, I can read it out for you. All right. Abby, I saw your hand first, so why don't you go ahead and then I see Gigi as well after Abby. Technical expertise for web archiving would be a good idea to acquire as a student.
Great question. That I am not prepared to answer. I have to think about this. Well, I think a general understanding of how websites are built is very helpful. So if you can take like an interactive web design class, if that's offered anywhere, it's just like, some JavaScript, some HTML5, some C++. Is just that is an infinitely helpful class. And then I think if there is any sort of offerings on digital archiving, if there is a web archiving class, I don't know if all programs are offering stuff like that, but then it'll take you through some of the basic tools like the file types that we archive in, WARC and WAXI, and the metadata that is included in those, like the technical metadata, and then the visnings. Tjeneste. I'm thinking in Norwegian. The viewing platform, the replay. Oh my God. That's kind of a good sign, I guess, that I'm integrating well. Um, yeah, but there's kind of three legs of the stool in web archiving. It's like the capture, the preservation, and then the replay, the making it available to the public. And things can go wrong at every stage. And so all three of those aspects are very interesting um, things to look at. And yeah, outside of a class, I think there are a lot of like online programs, like sometimes if it's not a full semester long class, you can find stuff on Library Juice Press and other offerings that are a little bit shorter and more kind of targeted. And you can also talk to me. Conferences. Oh, sorry. Last thing. There are conferences. The International Internet Preservation Conference is the web archiving conference. It's amazing. But also DigiPres in the US is quite good. And the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, they're always doing web archiving stuff. Yes, conferences. There's a great entryway for students, and often you can get funded scholarships, stuff like that, discounted fees.
Awesome. I just put in the chat a talk from IIPC in 2024, and one of our adjunct instructors gave that talk, so you can check that out too.
Who may or may not be teaching the fall Intro to Archives course? Maybe.
We think so. Currently on the schedule.
I think Gigi, you're welcome to read out your question, or we can read it for you.
All right, thank you. Thank you everyone for the presentation. So informative. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how one would go about archiving a small local newspaper that is seeing diminishing usership. The owners are in their 90s and there's no next generation to carry the work on, but it's so important to the community that they're part of. Is there an organization that could give them like a step-by-step, this is how you need to archive your work?
I don't know anything about an organization, but a local news library, particularly a large city that might have um, the resources. Because I know that in Cincinnati, the librarians have really been reaching out to other communities, trying to get those like community press kind of newsletters and newspapers archived. So that would be a great contact to reach out and find out what the librarians there would do. And places like ProQuest and newspapers.com are also grabbing that stuff. I do not know how the legalities work for that.
Right.
But I know more and more of those smaller print runs or papers that are extinct that have finished runs from the historic ones are being digitized, which is terrific because one of the downsides of when we used to just archive the stories, we just had the stories. And now when you archive an entire newspaper, you're getting the ads, you're getting the one ads, you're getting all these things. So for instance, I can look at newspapers.com and I've actually found when Neil Armstrong bought his farm in Lebanon, Ohio, because I can see the listing. I found Steven Spielberg's birth announcement because you can find that kind of stuff in Cincinnati stuff. And you see, and I go down the rabbit hole all the time where I'm looking for something and I end up looking at all the ads instead, and all the history that comes from that. So it's very important, I think, to have those archives. So I think if you reach out to the library and see what resources they might have. I mean, a smaller town library may not have that kind of money or accessibility to things, but I would think the local large city library start there.
Thank you.
That's a great answer. I will just reinforce. That's hopefully the biggest local library in the area would be able to help or also take on the archiving themselves because that's local history in that area. And it's so much better if the library does it than if a third party like newspapers.com does it, because really newspapers.com will then sell that content back to libraries and it affects our budgets.
Right.
Yeah, it's better than nobody doing it, certainly. And they do have the money to digitize it all and do it quickly. But if the library can do it, it's better than it's open to the public.
Right. Thank you for that.
So, Gigi, if this is a situation in the United States, then the people should try to contact the local state liaison for the National Newspapers Program,
Okay.
which could then digitize it as part of Chronicling America, and that there's a whole process where various states are feeding their state level newspaper content to Chronicling America.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And shout out to Beth Gray, one of our librarians who posted the link for Chronicling America earlier. So,
All right, we're over time, but maybe one more question if we've got time for a quick one.
I heard Victoria has 5, but
Yeah.
I'd like to ask one.
I can follow up with folks on email on 4 of the 5, but one thing that I was curious about is whether the sort of increase in crowdsourced transcription over the last sort of 15-ish years, including by libraries like Library of Congress, and now the advent of AI tools to generate transcription, which Rob touched on for one of the projects he's working on with his students, has really changed the scope of the kind of work, or like the velocity of the kind of work you can do with primary sources.
Any takers?
I'm not that familiar with the transcription stuff, but from what's available, like, because I'm mostly looking at print things, but I have used tools of like interviews and transcribing using the AI tools a little bit for ease. And right now, there's a lot of errors still in that stuff. And what I've seen of some early newspapers that they've digitized. So I think it's a way of speeding things up, but you still can't replace the going and reading and listening to the stuff. So it's I use it as a tool if I use it at all, because I'm hesitant to use AI in any form whatsoever personally. But I to get me to the point where I can focus. Like, it's like finding the right page in the book. Okay, now you told me what page I'm going to. Now I'll read that and delve into it. But I also think that AI is going to be such a game changer for everything that we don't even know what it's going to end up changing, and how we research and how we find this stuff, and which is even more so if the data is not there to find because it's been erased, because then the AI will not find it and it will repeat it as though it weren't there. Like in the case of Tulsa, it would just say that didn't exist. There's no record of that, so it must not be true. And so I think it's a little side off of AI a bit, but I think we got to be careful too of relying too much on it and not doing the actual research on our end.
So I think in terms of a call for action, all the educators on this call and students, just double down on basic traditional research methods that involve navigating a library website and knowing how to pull microfilm. It's because I'm seeing my students now, just today, like, well, I couldn't find that, doing a Claude search. I go, Claude is a fraud, stop it, I love Claude, but anyway, Claude is a fraud. It's a terrible way for you to do this research. You need to, go to in this case, the Hornbeck Special Collections website and search for this data yourself. And this person didn't have that skill, so we had to work through that. but it just AI is just going to be kind of like replacing some of these skills, and they just need to be taught in this generation. Absolutely, because it's going to go away very quickly.
No, I couldn't agree more with Rob and Jeff. I am a very much a bit of an AI pessimist. There is a very interesting documentary that Obama just posted about. And so then, of course, I went to look at it because I trust his judgment 100%. But it's called the AI doc, and it's very interesting. I'm just mentioning that as an aside. But also, I do think it's very concerning when we use AI to replace what we really need to strengthen ourselves and not weaken. And when we don't do it ourselves, that weakens our ability to do some things. It's so similar to how social media doesn't actually strengthen our social ties. It's weakening them. It's like the goals of a lot of these tools are to make money. It's billions of dollars are being made on AI. The goals are not aligned with like humanity's goals, which is very concerning to me. That said, I know there AI is in the future. It's unavoidable. So hopefully we can just align the goals of AI with the goals of like what we need really as a community, as in our communities. At the National Library, we are probably going to use AI to help curate collections, because we are trying to, for example, get Norwegian YouTube. What is Norwegian YouTube, right? Like, it's a ridiculous question, but we can't get all of YouTube. That data volume is tremendous. It's gigantic. And we don't have the lagringsplats. We don't have the storage space for that. We don't have the funds, right? So we have to try and so what we're going to do is try and use AI to help us to say, identify what are all the YouTube channels that are in Norwegian, there's two other variants of Norwegian, and one is Sami, which is our indigenous peoples here. And so we're trying to find samisk språk, the Sami language, Norwegian language, and then there's another variant of Norwegian, right? So we're probably going to use KI for artificial intelligence for that. And it'll be used a lot in curation, I believe, trying to narrow down a collection. So there's very interesting applications for it, but at the same time, I'm very concerned about AI generally.
There was a follow-up question that Victoria had about using for transcription, and Rob kind of mentioned you, but I'll just chime in here. The little bit that I had used, which to be honest, I didn't even really think of as like an AI tool like you do, but because my phone automatically gives me a transcription of an interview. And so you're like, oh, okay, it's there. And you look at this and it doesn't even get my name right. But what it does is it allows me to take an hour-long interview, and I can do a word search and say, I remember they were talking about, Obama. So I can look up Obama and I can find that part and say, yeah, that's that section. Then you go to read it through it. And then if you have that version that's already typed out, when you're cleaning it up, it's easier to read along and fix the spellings and stuff as you're doing it than typing from the beginning, stuff like, so that's in a sense that it can be used as a little tool to help without being a replacement for it. It's just a slight leg up. It's like a spell check. It's a tool that, I could read the whole document and look for that one typo, or I could have the computer do it for me. But I don't think you want to rely on that in any way. And of course, you would never just take a quote from the transcription that you didn't hear again and say, oh, well, this is what the AI said, they said.
Yeah, Victoria, the use that we did, we translated the handwriting into data, and with the death certificates. And I'm doing another history project where I had an address book that I got in a archive, looked like it was from the 30s. And I thought, wow, this would be great to construct a little network of all these different people in this address book. Took AI about 30 seconds to transcribe the entire address book. I need to go back and verify it, but it was just to do the queries on like how many of these people were government officials, how many were business people. It gave me a good, as Jeff was saying, a good start on further in-depth query. So handwriting transcriptions, I found Claude and Gemini to be quite useful.
We also in Cincinnati has a lot of new German newspapers, and all the and I'm not good with German, but the old German script, which is different and harder to read, you can't really scan, and so I think there are some tools, AI tools that can do that as well. Again, it's a start to then you have to translate the German and whatnot, and there are tools for things, but again, you still need to learn what you're reading.
Well, should we stop there at traditional research skills? I think that's a great, great place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we are so grateful to you all and so grateful to you all for staying on over time. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you for being so inspiring.